Everyone. Okay, let's talk about backwards compatibility. I believe it's something that you should take very, very seriously. I think it is a foundational belief that we have within the WordPress community and that the WordPress platform itself uses to its very core, that we don't break things between upgrades, and we try not to. We do our very best to never break user experience. We don't break sites during upgrades, and we try to build a good environment for other developers to work in our own code bases. So first of all, what is backwards compatibility? For your sake, if in the slides I might refer to it as BC, that's what it is. But very simply, backwards compatibility is not breaking things. It's not breaking things from version to version. So if you have version 1, you release version 2, everything in version 1 that was in version 1 still works in version 2. But it goes a lot further than that. That's a little too simplistic. It also means that if you have a method of doing something, it doesn't matter what that is. It could be functions, it could be classes, it could be styles, it could be JavaScript, it can be markup, it can be anything. You have a method of doing something in version 1. In version 2, that method still works. It might be deprecated, but it still works. It's still there, and people that are still using the older methods can still use them on the new versions. It also means keeping consistency. So it means that your design, your database schema, your markup, everything stays consistent from versions to versions. And let's talk about each one of these on their own. So start with design. Look back over the history of WordPress, and if you go back to version 1 or pre-version 1, it looks vastly different than it does today. However, what you will never have seen is a drastic jump between two versions. You don't go from version 3.9 to 4.0 and see a drastic change. You see an iterative change. And that's because they're keeping consistency between those versions in the design of the platform. So that when we have other people, other developers and themers and plugin developers that have built things on top of WordPress and have built into the design of the platform, their own designs don't break between those version upgrades. Think of it this way. If you're adding any UI elements to a page inside of WordPress, and you are taking advantage of the WordPress styling because you want to try to create a consistent experience, and then over an upgrade, if that design radically changes, suddenly you have a broken and disjointed UI. So one of the first things with backwards compatibility to think about is consistency. Things should stay similar from version to version. Obviously, you can make changes. I mean, if we look back at version 1.0 of WordPress to version 4.2, they don't look anything alike. There's similarities, but they're pretty drastically different. But that's because that's happened over 10 years. There are no drastic changes. Database schema. This is a really important one. With database schemas, you have to be very careful. You can't just make a database schema and then from version 2 to 3 decide to change it. Because if you do that, it's going to break things. Because people are querying the database based on the previous schema that you had. So if you have a column, you can't just rename that column because you want to. You can't just change data types because you want to. You have to keep things in mind on how people are using the data that's in your database. So anything related to the schema, it's adding tables, removing tables, adding columns, removing columns, all of these have to be done very carefully. Because if you are not keeping in mind how other people are using that data and using that data schema, then you're going to cause problems. Markup. This is another one I think people often forget about, is that once you introduce markup and you make it possible for someone to inject additional markup in there, or to style it, or to run JavaScript on it, if you change it, you're going to break things. So you have to do it very carefully. Let's think of a very simple example. Let's say that you have a plugin or anything in WordPress core that outputs a table, and it's got table rows, and then it has columns, it has cells inside of that table. And then between versions, you decide, you know, I don't really like tables. I want to use an unordered list instead. So you change it to an unordered list. But what you forgot about was that inside of that table, you added a hook, and you allowed people to inject additional rows at the bottom or the top of the table. And so you have plugin developers that have added additional rows to your table, and then you change it to an unordered list. Guess what happens? Bad things. You have to be very, very careful the moment you ever allow any kind of flexibility. And that's not a bad thing. It just means you have to keep those in mind. You also have to remember that if If you use some kind of markup, and then people style it, and then you change it, designs break. There's so many different areas in backwards compatibility that you have to be careful of. Basically, every single aspect of your code, whether we're talking the PHP, the JavaScript, the database, or any other thing that you have running in your platform, you have to be very careful with from version to version, especially when we're talking about an environment such as the WordPress world where people are extending code bases all the time. People are building add-ons for their plugins. People are building plugins for WordPress. People are theming plugins. These are things that you have to keep in mind when you're releasing code. Okay, let's go through some basic examples. We're going to start with PHP. Now, these are really, really simple, and when you really get into maintaining backwards compatibility, they get much more complicated than this. But let's start with the basics. So let's say in version 1, you have a function, do thy thing. It does something, and you realize at some point during the development cycle that you're not in Shakespearean times, and you also just had a typo because you have silly fingers like me. And so you leave a typo in, and you don't really like that. It doesn't seem very professional, so you decide in version 2 to do that. You fix it. It's now do this thing. Well, that's nice and proper and works well, and it doesn't bug you anymore until this happens, because somebody decided to extend your code and they didn't really care that you had a typo. They had they cared about the fact that you provided a function that they needed, and so they used it. And then you changed it, and it broke. It caused a fatal error. Solution is very simple. You leave the old function in, and you make it a wrapper to the new one. It's simply function do thy thing, returns do this thing. It's a really, really simple solution. It's not one that we love because we keep leaving old code in there that we would really like to get rid of, but it's a lot better than a fatal error. Okay, CSS and HTML. Let's say that you have some markup that looks like this. Div class of entry, and then somebody comes along and styles it, and they give it a background color of off-white. Well, you decide for whatever reason that you really don't like the entry class name, and you want to change it. And so, to appease yourself, you change it to post. And now you're happy, because it's the class name you want. Well, guess what? No one else knows that you changed this, and they're still using entry with a background. Oops, no more off-white. Now, this is obviously a very, very simple example, but imagine if you have an entire plugin, like a large plugin or WordPress that themes are styling extensively throughout dozens and dozens of pages and templates. If you start changing class names, things are going to break all over the place. And not just CSS, but JavaScript. So the solution is you leave it in. You don't really like the fact that you still have the entry class, but you leave it because it doesn't break things when you update. So you have post and entry. File names. WordPress has a file called plugin.php, and this file is used extensively in plugins. It's used extensively in plugins because there are certain functions in that file, such as is plugin active, that people want to use. But it's not available throughout all of WordPress. If in certain instances, you have to load the file yourself. So that means that there are thousands of plugins out there that are loading plugin.php. Well, let's say that one of the core developers or the core team of WordPress decides one day, you know, I really hate plugin.php. Why is it named that? Let's change it. Let's make it better. And so they change it to, I don't know, loader.php. Guess what happens? Fatal errors. Because thousands of plugins are including it directly. They're saying include once, abs path, plugins.php. And it's going to cause errors as soon as that file doesn't exist. So that means that WordPress core developers have an interesting problem. They cannot change that file, period. So the moment that they've introduced that, they can't change it again. It's stuck. There are kind of ways around it, but overall you can't change it. And that means that when you're when you're organizing your plugin or your theme or whatever you're building, you have to be very, very careful with it. Because just because you want to make a change doesn't mean you can. There's almost always consequences. So let's say that you have class authors PHP, and you're loading it like this. But then you realize, you know, I don't really have authors. I'm running e-commerce, and so what I really have are vendors. And so I rename it to vendors because it makes more sense. File's not found. That's a problem. For if anyone else is loading that file directly inside of their plugin because they want to take advantage of what you've put in there. That's a bit of an issue. Now let's get into where I think things get really fun. Metadata and other database-related stuff. Let's say that you store metadata for a post and you store it in a key called city name. Maybe it's the city that the author lives in. And so when you run get post meta, city name, you get a value of New York. That's great. But then because you decide that you want to be more succinct, you change it to city. Because city makes just as much sense as city name, but it's shorter, makes you happy. So you change it to city. So between version 1 and version 2, you decide my meta key is now city. Well, guess what happens when somebody does city name? It doesn't exist anymore. Okay, you know what? Maybe we wouldn't have ever really renamed our meta key because that's a silly example. But how about this? Let's say that you're storing stuff in metadata, and then you realize, you know, querying the metadata API or querying post meta is not really that efficient. So I'm going to move it. I'm going to move it to a taxonomy, or I'm going to move it to a custom table. Well, all of those people that were querying the metadata API using get post meta, suddenly that data doesn't exist anymore because you moved it. And you moved it for a good reason, but a lot of people are probably already using that. What do? You can do things like this. This is really fun. WordPress has filters all over the place. You can do add filter, get post metadata, and you can then specify the meta key that you want to use. And then when you detect somebody querying that meta key, you can return anything else you want. So in this simple example, we're simply returning a different meta key. But you could return any database query you want. You could use get terms. You could return a custom query to your custom database table. You can do anything you want. You can move data around freely when you start thinking about things like this. We actually did this recently for one of the plugins that I wrote. We had thousands and thousands and thousands of records in the post meta table, and we moved them to a taxonomy, and nothing broke because of an 8-line filter. So then when you call get post meta on city name, it returns a value of New York. And when you return get post meta city, it returns a value of New York because suddenly we're filtering the call to get post meta. Okay, these are really, really simple examples. Things get much, much more complex. If you've ever had an issue with backwards compatibility, like trying to figure out how to maintain it in your own plugin, you know that this is a much bigger issue than simply keeping a class name or not changing a file or naming a function. So I want to look at a couple of plugins that have broken backwards compatibility. And I don't want to do this to shame those plugins or to call them out, but to use it as a learning experience of looking at what did they do and what broke. We're not going to go into why they decided to do something or not do something. We're just going to look at them as examples. So some plugins that have broken it. Number one is mine. I broke it. A few months ago, Easy Digital Downloads is an e-commerce plugin for selling digital products. And I felt from the beginning that having support for quantities didn't really make sense because most digital products don't have a quantity. It's one product. But we had a whole bunch of users that wanted quantity support, and so we decided to add it. And so in one version, a couple of months ago, we added a quantity field to the purchase button. So you have an add to cart button, and then we added a little tiny quantity field right above it that just allowed you to specify, I want 2 of this, or I want 3 of this. Really, really simple change. Well, when we released it, suddenly our support forums got flooded with, you broke my site! My site's dead! Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Now, in reality, what really happened is we had this little tiny input field that got added above the button, and it broke layouts. And in some cases, it actually broke it drastically because people were styling the purchase forms exactly to their specifications. They had them in modal windows. They had them in other overlays. They had them in all sorts of places. And suddenly, when you put in a 25 pixel tall input field, things break. It's really minor, but it happens. And when you're talking about e-commerce and websites that run people's businesses, that's a bit of a problem. So in a way, we broke backwards compatibility because we changed the experience from version to version. It was a really little change, and one that we didn't think anybody would throw a fit about, and yet our support forums say otherwise. So, ways that we could have fixed it, maybe not turn it on for existing installs. Maybe we could have disabled it. I don't know. We didn't. Looking back on it, we probably could have done better. Soliloquy. This is a popular image slider from Thomas Griffin. I don't know what the version was, but at some point, he decided to change the selectors. And so the CSS that people were writing and the custom JavaScript that people were writing on top of Soliloquy suddenly broke because the class names are different. The IDs are different. And that's a bit of a problem. So we want to change things. We want to make them more cohesive with our standards, or we want to use class names that we like better. Maybe we originally didn't prefix our class names, so we want to add those prefixes in. Well, if your plugin is already out there in the wild, you have to leave those old ones there, because the people that are styling it, the people that are running additional JavaScript on top of it, it's going to break. WP e-commerce. Now, this is one of those plugins that's been around for a really long time. When they released version 1, there was something like 3,000 plugins in the world, which is obviously not the case today. And that means that they've gone through a lot of iterations, and they've gone through a lot of different CSS and a lot of different markup on the front end. Well, at one point, they decided to change it quite a bit. They changed the default styling in the plugin, and it actually ended up breaking a lot of the designs. The reason being simply that when you release a plugin that has a lot of front-end markup, and you have CSS that goes along with it, people tend to theme around the CSS that you provide. They don't always remove the CSS and just write their own. They go around your CSS. And so then, when you change the default CSS, suddenly theirs breaks, because the CSS that they wrote around doesn't work anymore. So maybe the default CSS originally provided a padding around buttons or images or whatever other elements you have. And then you remove that. And so suddenly the CSS that they had written that depended on that spacing doesn't work anymore. WooCommerce. Clearly we have an e-commerce theme here. They broke payment gateways at one point. They introduced a new API for payment gateways that made it a lot better. The new gateway was a lot simpler to use. It was more reliable. And they updated all their gateways. But it turns out that the old payment gateway API didn't work anymore, or there were inconsistencies with it, so it didn't always work. And when you have hundreds of different payment gateways out there that have been written by third parties or your own team, and those are still out there, that's going to cause a problem, because those gateways have to still work when people upgrade. This is the kind of problem that people really get into with backwards compatibility that I think are really fun and challenging, is figuring out how to make sure that things like that still work. Because when you have one version of an API and you radically change it and still trying to keep the old version working, that's kind of fun. Okay, keys to backwards compatibility. I think there's a lot of these. And number one, forget about the code. Programming is about problem solving. All programming comes to problem solving first, before you ever touch syntax. And backwards compatibility is a problem. And figuring out how to maintain it is a problem. And it is a challenge. And so you have to figure out your answer and your solution before you ever write the code. Once you figure that out, the syntax is easy. Almost always. But figuring out what the logical steps are to make sure that you're maintaining it, to figure out how to detect if you're even going to have a problem, that's the challenging part. The syntax is easy. And number two, I think you make a commitment. If you know someone that is very determined, who always works hard, they don't fail very often. I mean, they fail. Everybody fails at a lot of things. But if you take on a challenge, they say, we're going to figure out a way to do it. We will find a way, and it usually happens. So you make a commitment. You just say, I'm going to maintain this. I'm going to figure out a way to make sure that this still works when people upgrade. You make a commitment to backwards compatibility, and everything else comes next. Now we're going to go through a couple of specific keys. Template files, you better marry them, because they will be there forever. Always. The moment you introduce a template file, someone will change it. Someone will modify the CSS or modify the HTML. They will do something, and it will be there. I saw a comment on a popular plugin recently where they broke backwards compatibility because they changed a template file. And the developer's answer to it was, well, we didn't think anybody would be using it. You know, to be fair, there's some template files that we introduce, and you would think to yourself, no one has ever used this. No one. No one will ever use this. And so I can change it. Almost always wrong. Because somebody will find a way to change it. Someone will find a way to use it, a reason to use it, and they will. So if you introduce a template file, you have to be really, really careful about ever changing it, because someone has already done so. Extend your own. I think this is one of the best ways that you can learn how to maintain backwards compatibility in your platforms for a couple of reasons. When you start writing plugins for WordPress and you write really complex plugins, you tend to start to find where the weak points are, or you find where the breakpoints are, and you figure out where there are issues. And then when backwards compatibility breaks, you learn about those issues because they affect you. Well, if you're building a platform, extend it yourself, because that's going to force you to learn where those breakpoints are. It's going to force you to learn where backwards compatibility is difficult. It's going to actually cause you headaches because guess what? You will break your own code and it will infuriate you. But it will then make you want to fix that. And it will give you a good test to see whether or not you've maintained backwards compatibility. I recently did an update for a membership plugin I wrote, and I rebuilt the payment gateway API. And it was absolutely crucial that the old gateways still work in this case for me, because I use them. I use the old gateways. And so if those broke, my site broke. And so it was a really good motivator, a selfish motivator for making sure that I did it right. So extending your own code is one of the best ways that you can help practice backwards compatibility and help maintain it. I think there's some assumptions that you should never make. Never assume that someone has not modified a template file. Never assume that no one has changed your CSS. And never assume that no one has used your function or class name. We had a function in Easy Digital Downloads recently that somebody pointed out, and they said, oh, that's kind of cool. And I said, oh, no, don't use that because we're going to take it out because no one uses it. But I'm wrong, because that person noticed it. And that person said, I want to use that. So even if you don't think your code is ever used, or no one has ever used it, someone probably has. We only really know probably 1 or 5% of the actual use cases for our code. People find ways to do really weird things with your code that you would never expect. Really, really weird use cases. I've seen EDD used for some of the strangest applications imaginable that have nothing to do with digital downloads. And I think digital downloads is in the name. Why are you using it for that? People find really weird use cases. And so you never know how people are using it. And that means that you have to try and imagine every use case possible before you make a change, because someone's doing it in a different way. You should never assume, or you should always assume, that users don't read changelogs. I know there's a lot of people that do like changelogs, and there was actually a quick poll on WP Tavern a couple of days ago about, do you read changelogs? And it was like 75% yes. I'm sorry, there's no way that's accurate. Because the number of people, I just pushed out a big update for a plugin, and right at the top says, this is a major change, read here for these changes. The number of tickets that I got about those changes that were explained in the blog post tells me that no one read that changelog. None of those people read the changelog. People don't read them. And so that means that people will click update blindly. They will click update without actually knowing what's going to happen. They don't know what changes you're introducing. They don't know that you've broken backwards compatibility and that in your changelog or in your update release, you included instructions for how to move from version 1 to version 2. But they discover that their site's broken, and then they contact you. I think upgrades should always be seamless, no matter what. No matter how major the upgrade, it should be seamless. If you can't do it as a seamless upgrade, maybe you should do it over 5 upgrades. Something to consider. I don't think upgrades should ever require manual changes, for the main reason that users don't read changelogs. I think almost everybody here is a developer or works very closely with developers. And so you probably read changelogs because you're used to making changes. You're used to needing to know that. Most people don't care. And we're actually right now, we're really trying to encourage people to not be afraid of updates. We're trying to encourage people that automatic updates are good. Last night, there were automatic updates pushed out for Jetpack and a few other things. That's awesome, because those fixes got applied right away. And we're trying to encourage people that that's good, that's a good thing that's happening. But if we're not maintaining backwards compatibility and we're breaking changes from version 1 to version 2 or any other version, how can we ever expect people to be okay with updates? They're afraid of updates because things break. So let's stop breaking things. I think it's really that simple. So make a commitment to backwards compatibility.